We're considering the effect of government policy on international trade. And now we're going to take a brief foray into microeconomics to look at the effect of tariffs and quotas on the international economy. Consider a situation in which a country has a demand for a particular product. Maybe this is oil, and a supply of the same product. Demand decreases as the price rises, and the quantity supplied domestically increases as the price rises. Now, if this were a closed economy, the price would be set at the point where supply and demand cross. But let's suppose for a moment that this is an open economy, an economy that trades with the rest of the world. And the price of this good is set in world markets. And as far as this particular small country is concerned, the world price is a given. That means you can buy all the oil that you want at $20 a barrel. And any oil that you produce, you can only sell at the world price of $20 a barrel, because everyone else could buy oil at that price, and therefore you can't charge more. If you have a price that's set in world markets, then your customers in your country are going to buy the amount where the world price touches the domestic demand curve, right here, the quantity demanded domestically. And this world price touches the domestic supply curve here, which tells you the amount that your local suppliers are going to find it profitable to produce. The difference between domestic demand and the quantity supplied domestically, this is the volume of imports in your country. So people want to buy this much more oil in this small country than the producers in that small country are making at a price of $20 a barrel. This is the volume of imports. Now, international trade is a great thing because look at all the advantage that customers get. A lot more people can afford oil in this situation than could if the economy were closed and the price were higher. So, what happens now whenever the government decides to enact a tariff or a quota that is to reduce the volume of trade to allow domestic suppliers to charge a higher price for their product? What happens is we have to add the tariff or the effect of the quota onto the world price. Let's consider first the tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports of this good. So, if a tariff is imposed, then everyone who imports oil into this economy has to pay the world price plus the tariff on top of that. They have to pay the tariff to the government to bring the oil into the economy. That means that the domestic price of oil rises from $20 a barrel to $20 a barrel plus the tariff. Maybe the tariff is $5 a barrel, making the total price for oil now $25 if you want to bring a barrel into the country. Well, since imports are now costing you $25 a barrel, domestic producers can also charge $25 a barrel for their own production because they don't have to worry about foreign competition. The overall price of oil in this economy then rises to $25 a barrel, the world price plus the tariff. Now, at this higher price for oil, we get two effects. The first effect is the quantity of oil demanded shrinks because of the higher price. So the quantity demanded domestically with the tariff is going to be less than the quantity demanded domestically originally without the tariff. Also, now that you can charge a higher price for oil, more of the domestic suppliers are interested in producing oil and bringing it to market. So the quantity supplied domestically increases at the same time that the quantity demanded domestically shrinks. The overall volume of imports, notice, is smaller than it was before. We had a large volume of imports at the low price and a small volume of imports after the tariff is added on. Now, with tariffs, we wind up then with much less demand for imports. With less demand for imports, there is less demand then for foreign currency. So the domestic currency of this country is in shorter supply on world markets. People don't need to buy foreign currency to import oil, and therefore they keep their domestic currency at home, doing their shopping and their oil purchases at home. Because there's less supply of the domestic currency is going to tend to appreciate in the world markets for foreign exchange. What happens then is the tariff, by restricting international trade, creates a shortage of this country's currency in world markets. By creating a shortage of this country's currency, it leads to an appreciation of this country's currency. Remember, a short supply means a higher price. Therefore, tariffs, by shrinking the engagement of a country with the world markets, by reducing the supply of that country's currency in world markets for foreign exchange, leads to an appreciation of that country's currency. Let's consider now the way a quota would work, because it's quite similar. The way a quota works is slightly different. Instead of adding a price onto the world price, the quota says that only a given amount is allowed to be imported into the country. So if this country put a quota on oil imports, say a quota equal to this amount right here, the amount that we wind up having imported in equilibrium, then what happens is this quota creates a shortage of oil in the country. Remember, there's excess demand at the world price if the government will only allow this small amount to be imported. So what happens is the price of oil is bid up because of the shortage until the quota just fits comfortably between the demand curve and the supply curve. Finally, when this country is only importing the amount that the government will allow under the quota, then the price that we have is the price that gives us equilibrium. So rather than having a tariff, what we have is a new higher price in this economy because of the artificially created shortage due to the quota. Because the government has restricted trade in oil, the price rises in this economy. It's the same thing, though. It's exactly the same phenomenon. Now this country is importing less oil, and because it's importing less oil, less of its foreign exchange is going to be going into the world markets, therefore an appreciation. So an appreciation of your foreign currency, then, overall is going to incline foreigners to buy less from your economy, and it's going to incline people from your economy to want to spend more on imported goods in other markets that aren't being distorted by tariffs and quotas. So these are the effects, then, of trade policy on the trade deficit. If the government imposes tariffs and quotas, they tend to shrink the trade deficit. However, they also tend to lead to appreciation of your currency, which is going to cause people to want to import more from other markets. So then the government may have to go in and slap tariffs and quotas on those other markets as well. All in all, then, there's a connection between trade policy, the value of your foreign exchange, and your overall trade deficit. This is a microeconomic approach to the connection between government policy and foreign trade.
Morning class. This is the Econ 512 Introduction to International Trade class. Today is March 31st, Thursday. The class will move on to Chapter 10 of your textbook. The topic is the trade political economy of trade policy. In this chapter, we examine some of the reasons governments either should not or do not base their trade policy on economist cost-benefit calculations. So we discuss more about the political side of trade policy instead of economic theory. So here is the order of video clips. 1. Does a fair trade help the nation? 2. Robert Torrance on strategic trade policy. 3. The Cornell debate. 4. Economists of Bollywood. 5. Who supports free trade? 6. Why did trade plummet in the Great Recession? 7. World Trade Organization. 8. Trade Theory, Part 1. So here is the first video clip.
Fair trade is a trendy movement in wealthy nations right now. Let's take a look at whether it actually helps individuals and workers in poorer countries. Very often we see fair trade for coffee and also for coffee beans. What fair trade means is that the consumer, say in the United States, pays a higher price for the coffee. In return, that coffee is certified. That is, it is promised that the workers who helped produce that coffee were either paid more or treated better or worked shorter hours, or perhaps the production was environmentally more friendly, or maybe all of those things put together. Consumers would seem to be happy, and it also appears that the workers are better off. So who could possibly object to fair trade coffee? Well, to take a deeper look at fair trade coffee, we need to consider two prominent and very regular economics ideas. The first is the notion of secondary consequences, and the other is the distinction between the seen and the unseen. Let's look at fair trade coffee from this point of view. One potential problem with fair trade coffee or other forms of fair trade is that it tends to shift demand to the wealthier nations and the wealthier producers. Go back to what fair trade means. It means there's a certification that workers have been treated relatively well, and it means there's certification that the production process has met certain standards. For that certification to be actually trustworthy, usually it has to take place in a country which itself has a fair amount of trust, some reasonable institutions, a relative minimum of corruption, and actually relatively high per capita income. In other words, the decision to buy fair trade coffee is usually a decision that you don't want to buy coffee from the very poorest nations in the world. There's a lot of fair trade coffee coming out of Costa Rica, and in Costa Rica the per capita income in the course of a year, on average, it's about $11,000, which isn't very high, but it puts Costa Rica as one of the wealthier developing nations. Another major coffee exporter is Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is a much poorer nation than Costa Rica. Per capita income in Ethiopia is about $800 a year, and of course there isn't nearly as much fair trade coffee in Ethiopia than in Costa Rica. But which purchase does more to help the poor, the very poor, buying from Costa Rica or buying from Ethiopia? Arguably, buying from Ethiopia. Let's go back to this idea of the seen versus the unseen consequences of an economic decision. As a consumer buying fair trade coffee, perhaps you see the fact that you're buying more coffee from Costa Rica, the fair trade coffee. What is less visible is that now perhaps less coffee is being bought from Ethiopia, and this will harm some workers in Ethiopia who now will earn even less or will have fewer opportunities to produce coffee. Another question is to ask who actually captures the gains from fair trade coffee. As we said up front, when you buy fair trade coffee, the price of coffee is higher, so there is in some manner extra money in the system. But where does that extra money go? Does it go to the coffee shop? Does it go to a middleman? Does it go to the poor individuals working in the fields in some country abroad, be it Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Colombia, wherever it may be? Where does that extra money go? This gets us into some very complicated economics and a branch of economics known as tax incidence theory. Let's just say there are some fairly natural or common scenarios where the poor workers don't benefit at all. One such scenario would be the demand for coffee goes up, the demand for coffee laborers goes up. That in the short run raises the wages of coffee workers, but then more individuals try to become coffee workers, and that pushes the wages back down. Another possible scenario is simply that there's some kind of middleman or marketing board or intermediary which deals with the coffee producers in the poor country, and that intermediary makes sure that those producers back in the poor country aren't really able to demand a higher price for selling the coffee beans. Very often when there's extra money in a chain of production, the place where that extra money gets captured is the part of the production chain that has some kind of market power or monopoly power, that has a trademark or a brand name, that is seen by consumers as somehow being different from the other competitors. And who might that be? Well, I have news for you. That's very often the coffee retailer. So it could be that the higher price you're paying for coffee, ultimately the gains from that higher price are ending up mostly in the pocket of the coffee retailer. And of course, it's no surprise that coffee retailers generally like and promote the idea of fair trade coffee. That's exactly what you might expect if indeed a lot of the benefits were going back to the coffee retailer and not the poor laborers. In general, there's just not a lot of strong evidence that buying fair trade coffee or other commodities has a significant positive impact on living standards in poorer countries. Instead of paying the higher price for fair trade coffee, you may simply be doing yourself and indeed others a favor by just buying the coffee you want at the lower price, taking that excess money and sending it to a very good charity. To read more about fair trade, I would recommend these. Now let's consider the thought of Robert Torrance on strategic trade policy. We're again turning to Torrance's classic work, The Budget, published in 1834, and in particular we're looking at letter number 3 to Honorable Sir Robert Peel. Here's a picture of Peel. Peel was in Parliament and later he became Prime Minister. He was also the Prime Minister who led the abolition of the Corn Laws. So Torrance was writing his letter to a man who was already influential and bound to become much more influential when it came to trade policy. In this letter, Torrance made it clear that he favored free trade as the best situation for a nation, absolute free trade between countries. Recall that almost 2 decades earlier it was Torrance who discovered the idea of comparative advantage, one of the most important notions of economics. This is often attributed to Ricardo, but actually Torrance was the one who had it first. In our course on development economics, there are 2 excellent videos by Alex on this idea of comparative advantage. I would refer you there. Torrance did think there was some argument for protectionism, and that argument basically was the cost of transition for industries which were already being protected. Nonetheless, Torrance thought these industries were basically parasites, and it was one way or another necessary to remove that protection with what he called a cautious and skillful hand. The key point in this letter to Peel is what we now call strategic trade policy, and Torrance wrote that one of his leading principles was, quote, to adopt with all foreign powers the principle of reciprocity. That means that you lower your tariffs for them only if they lower their tariffs on you. Torrance thought that this principle would in the longer run lead to more free trade than not trying to induce tariff reductions from other nations. And furthermore, he thought that Great Britain during that time really did have the power and influence to engage in successful strategic trade policy. Torrance did ask the key question, what if there's a one-sided tariff? For instance, the nation of France places a tariff on exports from Great Britain, but Great Britain has free trade for France. What could go wrong in that situation? Well, Torrance had a pretty striking answer. He noted that if there was this one-sided tariff, that one country, in this case Great Britain, would lose precious metals to the other country, namely France. From contemporary economics, we know this principle doesn't exactly necessarily work this way. It depends upon elasticities where the precious metals will flow. But nonetheless, in Torrance's basic argument, if Great Britain cannot export more commodities to France, then there will end up being more specie in France because France is sending less gold to Great Britain in return for those exports. To continue our story, what happens when there's an outflow of gold from Great Britain? Well, for one thing, prices would fall, and Torrance saw this as a very bad macroeconomic outcome. He noted, and this is really quite striking, that this would increase the real value of debts in Great Britain, and this was actually an early version of the debt deflation theory of an economic downturn, which later became more popular with Irving Fisher and has continued to be an important idea today. And in this letter, Torrance wrote, and I quote, "A rise in the value of money is one of the greatest evils which can occur." So Torrance was a very strong opponent of deflation, and he saw reciprocal trade policy as one way of forestalling deflation in your country by stimulating your exports. Torrance also had specific ideas how strategic trade policy should be implemented. For instance, he was quite clear that you should never, no matter what, place tariffs on raw materials coming into your country because you needed those raw materials in order to process subsequent exports. At times, he gave the example of cotton being imported from America. Of course, at the time, Great Britain was a leading exporter of textiles. Torrance also defended British colonialism. For one thing, Having colonies allows you to construct a larger free trade area, but Torrance made the subtler point that colonies make trade reciprocity easier to enforce. That is, your strategic trade policy is stronger if you can threaten another nation with losing access not only to your home market, but to the home markets of all of your colonies. So Torrance saw colonies as increasing a country's bargaining power in trade relations. Here's maybe my favorite quotation from Torrance's letter to Peel. It comes early on in the letter, and I quote, "Dr. Pally has justly remarked that while it is in periods of excitement that public opinion is disclosed, it is in intervals of repose that it is formed." With that, he was in part suggesting that the public needed to have sounder opinions about foreign trade. The letter to Peel is really extremely important. It wonderfully lays out what we now call strategic trade theory, and it also links trade theory to factors of aggregate demand in a way that is a precursor of quite contemporary open economy macroeconomics. If there's any problem with this letter, I think it's that by modern standards, Torrance is maybe a little naive about how strategic trade theory will be applied. That is, it is rarely applied optimally, but it is often bent to the desires of special interests. So when a country perhaps ought to be removing its tariffs, it doesn't. So one danger of putting on tariffs, even for what might appear to be optimal strategic purposes, is you don't always take them away when you ought to. But in any case, this letter is really a quite striking display of virtuoso analysis from Robert Torrance. Now let's look at the Corn Law debates as they occurred in Great Britain throughout the early to mid-19th century. And remember once again, when British writers use the word corn during this period, what they really mean is grain. In England, there had been grain regulations, taxes, and tariffs since medieval times, but for many of the centuries from medieval times up through the early 19th century, these taxes and regulations, while far from efficient, they were relatively benign because often they simply weren't so binding relative to where market prices were standing at the time. But then, when we get to 1814, grain prices are falling quite rapidly with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and all of a sudden there are debates over revising the Corn Laws because the landlords in England want protection from the falling grain prices. There is then a policy debate between free traders versus protectionists, and in this debate we find economists on both sides. Perhaps the most able defender of some version of the Corn Laws was the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, and Malthus wrote 2 pamphlets where he laid out some reasons why perhaps Great Britain should not have free trade in grain. His first reason was national security. He was afraid of the food supply of Great Britain being grown in other countries. The second reason he gave had to do with political economy. Malthus was afraid that if you had too many workers in manufacturing, this actually would lead to a lot of labor unrest, and it would not be good for peace and stability. Malthus also believed that if the Corn Laws were removed, there would be a sudden fall in grain prices, and this could prove destabilizing. All of these points were written up in one of his pamphlets, published in 1814, and that was called Observations on the Effects of the Corn Laws. In this pamphlet, Malthus ultimately takes a "I'm not quite sure" perspective on what Great Britain should do, but ultimately he was to come down against complete liberalization. By the time 1850 rolls around, Malthus has produced a second pamphlet, The Grounds of an Opinion on the Policy of Restricting the Importation of Foreign Corn, and here he is turning more against free trade, and he argues that the Corn Laws, properly applied, can mean a greater stability of price for Great Britain, and he thought that some version of the Corn Laws would be better for both consumers and producers than would be free trade. In 1815, indeed, a Corn Law does pass. This raises the tariffs on grain, and it is backed by the Tory government of Lord Liverpool, and of course supported by large numbers of British landholders. Very few modern economists think that the Corn Laws were a good idea at all, and using modern statistical techniques, we can get a general sense of just how much the Corn Laws matter. So Tony Ward has an interesting piece online about the Corn Laws, and he estimates that without the Corn Laws, the price of grain would have been 9% lower, and the consumption of grain would have been 1% higher, and by most economic standards, this would have been a better outcome. David Ricardo, another British economist, was a strong defender of free trade, and in 1822 he comes along with his pamphlet on protection to agriculture, which argues a classic, what you would have to call Ricardian case for free trade. You can view our videos on Ricardo for more background, but for Ricardo, an essential benefit of freer trade is that it postpones the resort to inferior lands, which otherwise will drive down rates of return and hasten a move to much slower economic growth. Ricardo understood very well that the Corn Laws raised grain prices and distorted the allocation of capital. He argued against the tariff, and he had a very clear argument based in his theory of comparative advantage as resulting from trade, why the Corn Laws were most likely a very bad idea. Overall, it's the free trade arguments of the British classical economists which proved more persuasive, and in 1838 we see the organization of a group called the Anti-Corn Law League. Two of the leaders of that group were Richard Cobden and John Bright. They were not economists in the formal sense, but they were very influenced by economic arguments, and they argued with a very strong, almost messianic kind of zeal that Great Britain really needed to move to free trade. Pictured here in the photo is Manchester, which was one of the centers of the British free trade movement. In 1846, there was finally repeal of the Corn Laws by the government of Sir Robert Peel. Great Britain made a significant step toward freer trade. Often this milestone is viewed as one of the major instances when the classical economists really did change the world for the better. So what happened in the latter part of the 19th century after the Corn Laws were repealed? Well, there's a significant uptick in the ability of foreign nations to grow and transport grain to Great Britain, most of all the United States, but also Russia. This is due to more efficient railroads and more effective means of water transport. So during this period in England, we see grain prices falling and grain imports rising significantly, and there's a lot of evidence that moving to free trade in grain was a very good policy idea. For further investigation of this topic, well, for one thing, we recommend a lot of our videos. See our videos on the theory of comparative advantage, on Robert Torrance, some of our videos on Adam Smith. Those would be Book 3, Chapters 4 and 5, and also the video on digression on the corn trade for a lot of background information, as well as Smith's views on these topics. See also our video on the Irish question for the role of the Corn Laws in the debate over the Irish famine. There's an excellent book by Douglas Irwin. It's a history of free trade theories and debates, and that is called Against the Tide. Finally, for general factual background on the Corn Laws, one very good place to go is the book by Donald Barnes called A History of the English Corn Laws. Let's now consider some of the economics behind the national and global success of Bollywood and Indian filmmaking more generally. Bollywood movies are not just popular in India, but they've also been a big export success, most of all to many other parts of Asia and also to the Middle East. And keep in mind that although Bollywood is a kind of dominant cluster within India, there are plenty of Indian movies not made in Hindi, for instance in Bengali or Tamil. One striking feature of cinema is that it shows a lot of geographic clustering. For instance, in the United States, the center for cinema is Hollywood. It's not that most American movies are filmed in Hollywood. In fact, hardly any of them are. But you can think of Hollywood as a center for talent evaluation, project evaluation, and the finance of cinema. You can think of Hollywood and also Bollywood as being similar to banking centers. Just like there are major banking centers in New York, London, and Hong Kong, it seems that for cinema and the finance of cinematic projects, that tends to show a fair amount of geographic centralization as well. Why is this? Well, it could just be that a lot of the major talent needs to be together in the same city to have a lot of important face-to-face meetings. So why is it that India and Mumbai in particular have become centers for making and distributing movies? One key reason is simply that India has a large home market for cinematic viewing. Obviously, there are large numbers of Indians, and for many, many years now, India has been the biggest film cluster as measured by number of films made each year. It puts out many more films than, say, Hollywood does. Now, we know from the theory of international trade that countries which have large home markets are much more likely to be successes in exporting. The large home market is supporting a large domestic industry, which means making a lot of different films and experimenting with different styles, and the higher number of domestic customers when the home market is large means a lower per customer cost when making films. For more on these topics, see some of our videos in the international trade section and on increasing returns, and also the video on the work of Paul Krugman. One reason why the domestic market for movies in India has been so strong is simply the slower spread of TV in India. When people do not have televisions at home, they are much more likely to want to go out and see movies. Televisions in India are now much more common than they were, say, 2 decades ago, but there's still an effect here of path dependence. That is, TV was initially somewhat slow to spread in India. That led Indians to invest in a cinematic tradition, and then there has been this active cluster for producing and evaluating cinematic projects in Mumbai, among other parts of India, and that cluster has built upon itself and remained vital. 2 other reasons why India has such a vital movie-making tradition. One has to do with natural advantages in music and dance, and of course a lot of Indian movies have a great deal of music and dance. The second feature is democratic government, which has been present in India for a long time. There is some amount of censorship imposed on Indian movies, but it tends to have to do with social mores rather than politics. If you compare, say, India to China, China had many decades of quite strict communist rule, which really held their film industry in check for a long period of time. Right now, China is trying to catch up to India in movie making. We'll see how that goes. Hollywood movies are now much more popular in India than they used to be, but it's still worth asking, why is there relatively little Hollywood penetration of the Indian market? In a lot of countries, including parts of Western Europe, or say Australia and New Zealand, Hollywood movies really dominate the market, but that's never been the case in India. One factor is simply music. That is, Bollywood movies are renowned for the quite frequent use of music and songs. Along these dimensions, Hollywood movies simply can't compete, and of course Hollywood movies are unlikely to put a lot of Indian music into the movies because that might hurt their performance in other markets, including the domestic U.S. market. It's worth noting that to a lot of American listeners, Indian music sounds somewhat strange or unfamiliar. Consistent with this observation about music, Indian movies have had a lot of their export success in parts of the Middle East, where the native forms of music are in some ways microtonal, making them in broad terms somewhat similar to Indian music. Another reason why the Hollywood markets and Bollywood markets for movies are somewhat distinct have to do with the more conservative mores found in Bollywood movies. Hollywood movies are much more likely to have some kind of sex portrayed on the screen, whether implicitly or perhaps even explicitly. And in terms of what kind of family conflicts you see, or whether divorce is something which happens frequently, or just the general cultural context and setting, we find that on average, Indian movies and Bollywood cinema is simply much more conservative, and that gives it a greater chance of export success in some of the other more culturally conservative markets. These are fascinating topics, and they're also a lot of fun. In terms of formal research, they're actually still somewhat unexplored. You could look at this one article found online. There's my book called Creative Destruction, which has a whole chapter on the economics of cinema. It also considers Bollywood. This is another good online piece. And in general, just Google either Bollywood or economics of Bollywood to get to the latest writings on these topics. Now let's look at the question of who actually supports or opposes free trade. Empirically speaking, we're going to ask, what are the predictors of pro or anti-trade sentiment? And for this, there's a very good data set drawing on over 20,000 individuals from 23 countries, and this is all taken from a paper by Maida and Danny Roderick called Why Are Some People and Countries More Protectionist Than Others? One very good predictor of how much an individual will support free trade is that individual's amount of human capital. More human capital, more education, those predict support for free trade. You'll note this is consistent with the view that maybe better educated people are wiser, but it's also consistent with a more selfish look at whether or not people support trade. So if you think of a country which has a lot of people with high human capital, in essence, according to Heckscher-Ohlin, those countries are supporting goods with a lot of high human capital embedded in them, and you might expect individuals in those countries to support free trade. And in the broader data set, human capital predicts pro-trade views, but only in wealthy countries. In poorer countries, such as, say, the Philippines, human capital, in fact, correlates with anti-trade views. And this is also consistent with the Heckscher-Ohlin mechanism. Think of a poor country as specializing in exporting a lot of goods containing a lot of unskilled labor. So maybe in poorer countries, it's unskilled labor that benefits more from trade, and the skilled labor arguably loses out because it means it has to compete more with the wealthier countries. What also predicts support for free trade is when individuals have an income which is high relative to the national average. What other features characterize or predict protectionists? Well, there are at least three. One is high attachments to neighborhood and community. The second is a lot of national pride. And the third is a strong belief in national interest as driving policymaking. When you pose related questions to free traders will reflect a viewpoint which might be considered more cosmopolitan, that is, looking at the interests of the entire world rather than just a single home nation. It's interesting that a lot of the predictors of free trade support within nations also seem to predict free trade support across nations. So for instance, in this data set, the country with the greatest intellectual support for free trade is the Netherlands, which is a relatively wealthy and also relatively cosmopolitan country. And also in this data set, the country which supports free trade the least in terms of expressed opinion, well, that's Bulgaria, and they also, within this data set, have an income well below the average. It's quite striking within the data that men tend to be more pro-trade and more pro-free trade than women. We also can consider the relevance of sector-specific models of international trade. So to the extent some factors are immobile, the return to that factor will depend what sector it's in. So we find, for instance, perhaps what you would expect, and that is individuals in losing sectors, sectors losing out to foreign trade, those individuals are less likely to be pro-free trade. To read more on this topic of public opinion and how it affects policy, and also policies about trade, I also would recommend some writings by Brian Kaplan, his articles and also his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. For the latest data on public opinion toward free trade right now, it's useful to just Google public opinion free trade. Now let's consider the question of why international trade fell so fast during the recent Great Recession. Relative to GDP, which was already falling, global trade fell by about 30% during the years 2008-2009. So you may be wondering, why is it that trade fell so much faster than GDP? Well, keep in mind, a lot of international trade is based in durables, that is, goods which can last a long time. Non-durables are harder to trade, in part because they perish fairly rapidly, but also a lot of non-durables, such as, say, strawberries, they're relatively easy to produce, and they're produced in many different parts around the world, and it's not that you need to go to the Silicon Valley of strawberry production to get a good strawberry. The thing about durable goods is that it's relatively easy to postpone spending to buy a new one. So if all of a sudden you're in a recession and you lose your job or your income is lower, rather than buy a new car, well, just get the old car fixed. So what happens is that in the short run, expenditures on, say, automobiles will fall more rapidly than, say, expenditures on food. According to the best estimate we have, the shift away from spending on durables during the recession, that accounts for about 65% of the overall collapse in trade. And that's taken from an important paper called Trade and the Great Recession. If you look at branded differentiated goods, it's interesting to note that during the Great Recession, a lot of them didn't lower their prices at all. They may have thought, well, soon demand will come back, and in any case, we don't want to cheapen our brand. So that price remaining steady may be another reason why demand is so much falling off. Why not simply wait until your income is higher again? Where we did see the price flexibility was for undifferentiated goods, for instance oil, rather than, say, Mercedes-Benz. During the Great Recession, the price of oil fell a good deal, and that helped to maintain the consumption of oil. Another reason why some international trade fell off during the Great Recession simply had to do with credit. Some international trade is based on letters of credit, extension of credit, and trade credit, and the Great Recession hit credit and financial intermediation very hard, and that had a secondary knockdown effect on trade as well. The good news about all this is just as international trade fell very rapidly, it also recovered very rapidly in 2009-2010. It was one of the first areas where the global economy saw some systematic recovery. This volatility for international trade also meant a good deal of income volatility for some countries, for instance Singapore, which relies fairly heavily on international trade, manufacture, transport, and also being a financial center for international trade elsewhere. 2004 to 2007, growth in Singapore is about 7 to 9%. That's great. 2008 to 2009, the Great Recession. Growth in Singapore is only a little bit above zero. 2010, some recovery is coming, and in Singapore they get to make up some of the lost trade, and it's growing now at about 14.8%. And here, both the initial plunge and the very rapid bounce back, well, mostly those are coming from external forces. To read more on this topic and for some background figures and information, I very much recommend these 3 articles, all available online. The World Trade Organization is a multilateral body which pops up frequently in discussions of development economics. Let's look at this a little more closely. The World Trade Organization, or WTO as it's often called, has 2 primary functions. The first is it oversees a series of trade agreements which individual nations sign on to when they join the WTO, and furthermore, the WTO is a forum for negotiating disputes, settling disputes, and then enforcing a trade dispute. In other words, the WTO is also a court, and it has a kind of police power, namely the ability to levy fines. A typical WTO case involves the United States and the European Union. The United States has charged that European governments gave unfair subsidies to Airbus, the major European maker of large planes, and that this placed the United States company of Boeing at a disadvantage. The initial ruling was in favor of the United States, although the case continues, and the question now is whether the European governments have in fact stopped those subsidies. In general, WTO cases tell countries they need to lower their tariffs or stop subsidizing their exporters, or in other ways abide by the rules of what is considered under the agreement to be some kind of fair world trading order. A few other facts about the WTO. As of 2012, it has 155 members, with 156th, Russia, on the way. These members include the world's major trading nations. The WTO dates from 1995, but before then something quite similar was called GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and this was constructed in the immediate aftermath of World War II as a way of keeping the global trading order relatively free. Over time, more and more nations have entered into GATT and now WTO. There's something called the Doha Development Round that was launched in 2001, and the purpose of those talks has been to try to lower tariffs even further. But keep in mind that since World War II, a lot of tariffs have already come down quite a bit, except for the area of agriculture, and getting further gains on lowering tariffs at this point actually has proven fairly difficult. The WTO is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and there's also a part of it which overlooks intellectual property, and that's called TRIPS, which is an acronym for Council for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. Let's look at some of the general principles embodied initially in GATT, and they have essentially been carried over into WTO. First is the idea of non-discrimination, that a trade break or tariff reduction extended to one nation should, as much as possible, be applied to other countries as well. There's the idea of reciprocity, namely that countries would mutually bargain for greater trade and reduction in tariffs. Commitments are considered binding and enforceable, and trade policy is supposed to be as transparent as possible. Note finally that both under GATT and now WTO, if a trade restriction survives WTO, in some ways this strengthens that trade restriction because it's shown it's okay under international rules of order, and the clear example here would be restrictions on trade in agricultural products. Sometimes the very process of joining WTO can be quite important. The process can take a long time, 5 years or more, and when China applied to join WTO, they had to make a lot of economic and legal changes in order to be eligible. According to one estimate, they had to dismantle at least 7,000 different barriers to trade. Russia, which is now seeking to join the WTO, is having to reform its economy in similar ways. These are considered some of the benefits of having WTO, namely that it gives developing nations some reason to move toward freer trade policies. Of course, for the same reason the WTO has its share of critics. Most economists are strong advocates of free trade, but not all commentators and observers agree with this perspective, and those individuals who favor trade protectionism for developing nations tend to be strong critics of WTO. Over time, the WTO seems to matter somewhat less. The first key point is that a lot of progress in reducing trade barriers today, it comes in the form of bilateral agreements rather than multilateral agreements for the entire world. So the United States and Costa Rica may make a deal, the United States and South Korea or Colombia may make a deal, but these are country-to-country deals, and over time we've seen more and more progress coming in that form rather than through WTO. The second point is that the major remaining areas of trade barriers for a lot of countries are agricultural subsidies and sometimes tariffs, and those seem to be persisting. WTO has not really been able to crack those. Finally, there's a paper by economist Andrew Rose, and the title of his paper is, "Do We Really Know That the WTO Increases Trade?" And he looked at the numbers and he argued that there's actually an ambiguity here. Most countries are reducing tariffs and trade barriers over time anyway, and it's not clear that joining earlier GATT and now WTO makes that big a difference. There's been a lot of debate around this paper, and economists disagree as to what's the correct statistical model here. But the mere fact that a serious paper could be written challenging whether the WTO makes a difference at all is here the important point. When you read the popular press, when you read some of the critics, you often see a quite sensationalistic treatment of the WTO as if it is some major force ruling the world order and destroying democracy and forcing developing nations to do all kinds of things they don't want to do. When you look at the evidence, it seems the WTO really may have some marginal impact on freer trade and encouraging countries to join and encouraging countries to get rid of their trade barriers. But in general, a lot of the popular discussions of the WTO, especially the negative ones, have an exaggerated sense simply of how much power the WTO has. By the way, for more information on all these topics, just Google the words on these various slides, starting with World Trade Organization. You can also read Andrew Rose's paper, but there's plenty about the WTO online. And if you go to news.google.com and put in World Trade Organization, you can see what's new.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this lecture in International Trade Theory. So, today I would like to give an overview of how trade theory developed over time. I'll start with the approach which has the longest history, and we'll end up with the Krugman model, which is the newest approach to international trade. We want to find out whether international trade is beneficial, yes or no. This is the most important question, which is in the focus of international trade theory. So, let's start with the first approach, which is called mercantilism. And there is a quote of Thomas Moon from 1664. And this quote describes and condenses very much the thinking of the mercantilist approach. Thomas Moon said, "The ordinary means, therefore, to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value." So Thomas Moon is very clear. He argues that international trade is beneficial, but international trade is only beneficial when exports are larger than imports, so when one country is running a current account surplus. Let's have a deeper look into this mercantilist view. So mercantilism, it's a collection of economic thoughts during the time period 1500 to 1750. It dominated the economic thinking and the governmental policy. The main idea was that national wealth is reflected in a country's holding of valuable metals, so gold and silver. And this is very interesting because of the fact that the big question is, where does this gold and silver end up? It ends up in the pockets of the king. So one country which is very successful in international trade and is running a trade balance surplus, so exporting more than is importing, then this economy will acquire gold and silver coins, because at this point in time, goods and services were paid in gold and silver. Where does this gold and silver coins end up? In the end, it ends up in the cellar of a castle of a king, and hence this king will become richer and richer and richer. During this time period, we had a static view of world resources. The idea was that world resources are constant, so the number of gold and silver in the world is constant. Furthermore, it was believed that economic activity is a zero-sum game. This implies that when one country is running a current account surplus, another country is running a current account deficit. So, when one king is acquiring gold and silver coins, another king will lose gold and silver coins. And this is very important because a king which has a lot of gold and silver is able to afford a lot of soldier, so he's mightier compared to other kings. And when one king is acquiring gold and silver coins, he can increase the number of soldiers, while another king has to decrease the number of soldiers. So one king is gaining power via international trade. This implies that economic activity should be regulated. For example, imports should be restricted. Imports should be restricted because imports would lead to an outflow of gold and silver, and then the king would lose gold and silver coins. Furthermore, we have exclusive trading rights for certain routes or areas. Special companies have granted the right to trade in these areas or routes. So we have a monopolistic situation, and this is very easy to control compared to a situation where each and everyone can export. So here we have these exclusive trading rights so that the king can monitor how much is exports, how much is exported, and how much gold and silver coins are collected on the one or the other route. Capital controls is important, so the king needs to know how much capital is going out, how much capital is going in. The king, of course, wants to keep the gold and silver coins within his economy. Furthermore, exports are subsidized. Exports are subsidized so that the price of exports goods is very low, so that this economy can be successful in international trade. How can we subsidize exports? Of course, by keeping the wages low. This is a very important idea, to keep the wages low. Labor in this time period is very important. It's a very important factor of production. And when we keep the labor cost low, then the exports prices can be kept very low and our economy can have success in international trade. But here already a kind of paradox pops up. A rich nation in the mercantilist sense is an economy where we have very large number of very poor people. The people are very poor because the king is trying to keep the wages relatively low. So gold and silver was accumulated at the expense of current consumption. This is very interesting. Mercantilism means a rich nation is a nation where we have very poor workers, where the society is living in very poor conditions. Adam Smith, in the year 1776, he has a different view on the economy. He was writing something in his very famous book, The Wealth of Nations. Smith said, a nation's wealth is reflected in its production and consumption possibilities and not in its holding of precious metals. So, in case that one economy is able to produce a lot, the society is also able to consume a lot, and he believes that the wealth of a nation is reflected by the production and the consumption possibilities. This is a completely different view compared to the mercantilist view. Adam Smith, he believes that the growth in production can be fostered best in an environment where people are free to act in their own interest. Perhaps you are aware of this famous quote where Adam Smith asked, why is a baker standing up so early in the morning to make the bread and so on? It's not because the baker is such a good man and he wants to do something good for society. No, this is not the case. The baker is acting in his best interest by standing up early in the morning because he's so good in making bread and he wants to make a profit out of making bread. This is very important, that everybody is able to act in his or her own interest, and this will increase the production possibilities and thereby will also increase the consumption possibilities. Adam Smith, he was not coming up with a theory of international trade. We have to wait a few years until David Ricardo comes up with the first international trade theory. So let's have a look at the second chapter, Ricardo, Absolute and Comparative Advantages. You can see here a picture of David Ricardo. He lived from 1772 until 1823. In the year 1817, he wrote the book Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And in this book, he wanted to come up with some very nice arguments to support the British or the English government, to find some nice arguments that the Portuguese country should trade with England. In this time period, it was a case that Portugal was the country which was advanced in a technological sense. So they had the better production functions, they had the higher stand of knowledge, and they were ahead compared to England. Nevertheless, Ricardo wanted to construct some nice arguments so that in the end, the government of England has some good arguments to convince Portugal that Portugal should trade with England. Let's have a look at the assumptions of Ricardo's theory. We are looking at two countries, England and Portugal. We are looking at two goods, cloth and wine, and we have only one factor of production. We are looking at a production function where we are only including labor. Look at that. Ricardo, he formulated his ideas in 1817. So it's not the case that we are producing with too much capital. So a lot of things were not invented in 1817, so that labor is still a very important factor of production. We have the following input-output relationship. Labor, L, is equal to A times the quantity Q produced. The variable A, it represents the labor requirements, the units of labor we need to produce 1 unit of output. So in case that we want to produce 1 unit of output, we need A units of labor. In case that we want to produce 2 units of output, we need 2 times A units of labor. Furthermore, an important assumption is that the technology and the production functions differ between the two countries. The two countries are producing with different production functions because of the fact that the stand of knowledge is different. And therefore, we are looking at two countries which has different relative prices in autarky. In the table below, we find the different labor requirements in England and Portugal in the two different industries. So, for example, the 3 in England in the cloth industry has to be interpreted in the following way. We need 3 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth. In the British wine industry, we need 6 hours of labor to produce 1 bottle of wine. In Portugal, it is the case that we only need 2 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of cloth, and 1 unit of labor to produce 1 bottle of wine. When you compare these labor requirements in Portugal and England in the cloth industry, you can see that the labor requirements are lower in Portugal. So Portugal has an absolute advantage in the cloth industry. They really know how to make cloth. They know it better than England. They are advanced in the cloth industry. But also when you look at the wine industry, it's a case that the labor requirements in Portugal are definitely lower than in England. So in England, we need 6 hours of labor to produce wine, and in Portugal only 1. So Portugal also has a so-called absolute advantage in the wine industry. In order to find out whether the one or the other country has a so-called comparative advantage, we have to compute the opportunity cost of producing wine. The opportunity cost of producing wine in England are equal to 2 units of cloth for 1 unit of wine. Why is that? In case that we want to produce 1 unit of wine more in England, we need 6 hours of labor. Where do we get this labor from? We get the labor from the cloth industry in England. And when we are extracting 6 units of labor from the British cloth industry, it's a case that cloth production will decrease by 2 units. So in order to produce 1 unit of wine, cloth production has to shrink by 2 units. So the price of 1 bottle of wine in England is 2 units of cloth. How large are the opportunity costs of producing wine in Portugal? In Portugal, in order to produce 1 unit of wine, we need 1 unit of labor. Where do we get this labor from? We get it from the cloth industry. In case that the wine industry should increase by 1 unit, it is a case that we need this unit from the cloth industry, and when we extract this 1 unit of labor from the cloth industry, cloth output will decrease by 0.5 units. So 1 unit of wine in Portugal costs 0.5 units of cloth. When we now compare the opportunity cost of producing wine in England and in Portugal, it's a case that wine is relatively cheap in Portugal. So Portugal has a comparative advantage in the wine industry, and England has a comparative advantage in the cloth industry. Let's check what can be produced and what can be consumed in the autarky scenario. Autarky scenario, this is a scenario where no international trade takes place. Each country produces and consumes in isolation, no international trade. Let's have a look at the assumptions. We assume that each country has 600 units of labor in total, and in the autarky scenario, each country splits this labor units 50-50 among both sectors. So we have 300 units of labor in the British cloth industry and 300 units of labor in the British wine industry. How many units of cloth and wine can be produced with 300 units of labor? When we put 300 units of labor in the British cloth industry, we can produce 300 divided by 3, 100 units of cloth. In the British wine industry, we can produce 300 divided by 6, 50 units of wine. What about the Portuguese case? So also in Portugal, we split the 600 labor units 50-50 among both sectors, so that 300 units of labor are allocated to the cloth industry. 300 divided by 2, Portugal can produce 150 units of labor. In the wine industry, 300 divided by 1, 300 bottles of wine are produced in the Portuguese wine industry. When we sum up, the world production in cloth is 250 units and 350 units of wine are produced worldwide. What is important here is to stress we are still in the autarky scenario, so production in England will stay in England. Production and consumption is the same because no international trade takes place. Now, after we have characterized the autarky scenario, we want to have a look at the scenario where international trade is allowed. We'll come up with one assumption. We'll assume that England will produce more cloth because England has a comparative advantage in the cloth industry, and England will produce less wine. So England produces 1 unit of wine less than before. Portugal has a comparative advantage in the wine industry, and Portugal produces 1 unit of cloth less and will specialize in the wine sector. What happens if this kind of specialization takes place? How many units can be produced in England and Portugal? So we said previously England is producing 50 bottles of wine, and now they are producing 1 bottle of wine less, so the output in the British wine industry is 49. When England is producing less wine, the workers can move from the wine industry to the cloth industry. So, 6 units of labor can now be allocated in the cloth industry, and with 6 additional units of labor in the British cloth industry, output in the cloth industry can increase by 2 units, so that 102 units of cloth are produced. Once more, we are producing now 49 bottles of wine in England, 1 less than before, and 6 labor units can move from the wine industry to the cloth industry, and cloth production can increase from 100 to 102 units. Let's switch to Portugal. Previously, in the autarky scenario, Portugal was producing 150 units of cloth. Now Portugal should produce 1 unit of cloth less, so 149 units are produced. Hence, 2 units of labor can move from the cloth industry to the wine industry. And these 2 additional units of labor in the Portuguese wine industry can produce 2 additional units of wine. Therefore, wine output in Portugal is up from 300 to 302. When you now take the sum, you can see that world output increased from 250 units of cloth in autarky to 251 units of cloth in the scenario with specialization. Also, wine output is up from 350 units to 351 units. Hence, we can see in the last row of this table that world output increased, and hence it's just a question of how this additional world output is split between the 2 countries so that both countries can benefit from international trade and benefit from specialization. On this slide, you can see 3 different tables. In the upper right part, you can see the production and consumption quantities in autarky. The second table, once more, contains the production quantities after specialization. And now we want to have a look at the consumption possibilities after international trade. Therefore, we once more need some assumptions, and the assumptions are as follows. The terms of trade are equal to 1-to-1. So the two countries are exchanging cloth and wine on a 1-to-1 basis. So the price of 1 unit of cloth in the international markets is 1 unit of wine. But we are not assuming that only 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of wine is exchanged, but England is exporting 1.5 units of cloth and Portugal is exporting 1.5 units of wine. When England is exporting 1.5 units of cloth, 102 units are produced, 1.5 units are exported, so that 105 units of cloth will stay in England. Portugal is producing 149 units of cloth, but is importing 1.5 units of cloth from England, so that the consumption quantities in Portugal with respect to cloth is equal to 150.5. 149 units are produced in Portugal and 1.5 units are imported from England. What about the wine consumption? Portugal is producing 302 bottles of wine, but is exporting 1.5 bottles to England. So 302 minus 1.5 gives us 305 bottles of wine in Portugal. England is producing 49 bottles of wine and is also importing 1.5 units of wine from Portugal. So the consumption possibilities are equal to 50.5 bottles of wine. What is now very important, we have to compare the consumption possibilities in England in the cloth industry in the autarky scenario. So here England was able to consume 100 units of cloth, but now with specialization and international trade, cloth consumption can increase. This also holds for the wine consumption. In the autarky scenario, consumption possibilities were equal to 50 bottles of wine, and now wine consumption can increase to 50.5 bottles. What about the Portuguese economy? In autarky, Portuguese were able to consume 150 units of cloth, and now cloth consumption can increase to 150 in the scenario where the production specializes and international trade takes place. Also, the wine consumption is up from 300 to 305 units of wine. Hence, we can see here that international trade is beneficial. Both countries can consume more cloth and more wine compared to the autarky scenario. Each country was specializing in that industry where the country had a comparative advantage. After the specialization, international trade took place, and then consumption possibilities increased. This stylized example highlights the ideas of David Ricardo. So David Ricardo, he wanted to give some good arguments to the British government so that the British government can convince the Portuguese government to trade with England. It was not that obvious why Portugal should trade with England, because Portugal was ahead. Portugal was ahead with respect to the current stand of knowledge. Portugal was ahead with respect to the production possibilities. So Portugal had an absolute advantage in the cloth industry and an absolute advantage in the wine industry. Nevertheless, Ricardo was able to show why it makes sense that Portugal should trade with England. It's because of the fact that consumption possibilities can increase in England and in Portugal. One interesting story is that when you look at British textbooks nowadays, frequently you find the scenario in the other way around. So in British textbooks, it's frequently the case that it's the British economy which has lower labor unit requirements compared to Portugal. So in British textbook nowadays, it seems to be the case that England is ahead, and England has the better production possibilities and the higher stand of knowledge. But this is not in line with the history. It was the case that Portugal was ahead compared to England. So we are done with a Ricardo model where absolute and comparative advantages play a role. And in the end, it is the case that consumption possibilities increased. Both countries are better off with specialization and international trade compared to the autarky scenario.